Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We're going to continue where we left off yesterday in the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, demonstrating the capability, the astuteness of Pope Leo XIII in defending the papal monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church's right to rule the world, the papacy's right, rather, to rule the world. R.W. Thompson says in the last full paragraph on page 380, if you're following along, he says, when the archbishops and bishops of Umbria deemed it proper to protest to the Piedmontese government against its infringement of papal rights, Cardinal Pesci, that is, Pope Leo XIII, before he became Pope, Cardinal Pesci was chosen by them as specially fitted for that delicate and important work. As the population of Piedmont were Roman Catholic, and there had been no attempt on the part of the government to interfere with what they considered the established faith of the Roman Catholic Church upon strictly religious points, this protest was mainly intended to express opposition to the laws which regulated the relations of the Roman Catholic clergy to the state by requiring the priests to obey the public statutes as they are required to do in the United States and in such countries as have disunited church and state. Now, this is a portion of history that few hear about, that the Roman Catholic Church, the papacy, and his priests claim immunity from civil law. And if you want to see what corruption, they are exempt from any civil law. They're isolated from any interference from governments. They're just rank criminals. And obviously, if you're a regular listener to Inquisition Update and you heard the reading of the book Vicars of Christ, The Dark Side of the Papacy, you realize what that protection does for the papacy. It leads to corruption of the Pope and his priests. And because of that corruption, the Piedmontese government insisted that the priests be subject to the civil laws. Now, obviously, if the priests of the Roman Catholic Church were subject to the civil laws of the nations, many of them would be in jail for pedophilia. In every country around the world, they would be jailed for having sexually abused minors. But they're not subject to the civil law. The Roman Catholic Church insists that these priests who have been accused of such crimes are subject to the pontifical secret, and their cases are not to be publicized in the mainstream media, and that the Pope has jurisdiction over these priests and no one else, and that these priests can only be dealt with by the papacy, by the Roman Catholic Church. And so the pedophilia continues. The Piedmontese Roman Catholics were sick and fed up with the corruption of the priests, and they wanted to make those priests subject to the civil laws. Has anything changed? Nothing. And it says up until that time, they had been an exclusive and independent class with privileges and prerogatives not enjoyed by the mass of citizens, such as exemption from taxes and from the support of the government. And to change in these relations, this protest was intended to apply. The laws then existing were considered an irreligious invasion of the liberty of the clergy, that is, of their right of exemption from all governmental obligations. Consequently, the feeling upon the subject became very intense among the clergy, as was to be expected after so many years, or rather centuries, of license and indulgence. And it furnished Cardinal Pesci with the opportunity of making an admirable display of his intellectual powers and eloquence. I would add his Jesuit training. And it says, without preface, he came to the question directly in these words, quote, this is Cardinal Pesce before he became Pope Leo XIII, in dealing with this insistence by the Piedmontese Roman Catholics that the priest be subject to the law. Quote, it is a grievous error against Catholic doctrine to pretend that the Roman Catholic Church is the subject of any earthly power and bound by the same economy and relations which regulate civil society. The Roman Catholic Church is not a human institution, says Pesce, nor is it a portion of the political edifice, although it is destined to promote the welfare of the men among whom it lives. It affirms that from God alone came directly its own being, its constitution, and the necessary faculties for attaining its own sublime destiny. I wonder what that sublime destiny is. Government of the world. And it says, which is one different from that of the state and altogether of a supernatural order. Divinely ordered, with a hierarchy of its own, it is by its nature independent of the state, unquote. So you have before you the proclamation that the Roman Catholic Church is sacrosanct. Or rather, the Pope is sacrosanct, and so are his priests. And of course, if you're doing the math while we're reading along here, the kings over which the Pope ruled were also sacrosanct, demonstrated by the fact that any word spoken or written against the king was subject to execution, just as was any word spoken or read or written about against the Pope. They had been hauled off to the Inquisition and summarily pronounced guilty and executed. Now, continuing now where we left off yesterday, he says, R.W. Thompson says, he makes the whole superstructure of his argument rest upon the foundation that as the Constitution and all the faculties of the Roman Catholic Church came from God, therefore it must of necessity have a, quote, hierarchy of its own, unquote, and entirely, quote, independent of the state, unquote. That is, the clergy must be bound to obey the Pope and released from all obligation to obey the laws of the state, unless they also shall be approved by the Pope. To require from them this obedience to state laws, quote, invades, unquote, according to this protest, quote, the sacred province of the priesthood. You know, the sacred province of the priesthood, there's your sanctity of the priest. They're untouchable. And he says, because it tempts them, quote, away from the due subjection to their superiors, unquote, who are governed only by the Pope and Roman Catholic canon law. So they're only subject to the Pope and Roman Catholic canon law. You can't touch them. I can't touch them. The government can't touch them. They're free to do as they please. And only the Pope has jurisdiction over them. He says, in order to show that the church cannot tolerate liberalism, that's what we call those nations which defy the Pope, defy Roman Catholic canon law, and that order of things that the Pope demands in exchange for their own set of laws and morality and religion, that the church cannot tolerate liberalism in the form of the freedom of religious belief or of the freedom of the press. This protest deplores the licentiousness, it is called, the, quote, licentiousness of the theater and of the press, and the continual snares laid to surprise pious souls, to undermine faith by circulating infamous pamphlets and heterodox writings, and by the declamation of fanatical preachers of impiety, unquote. In other words, listen to what R.W. Thompson says, by Protestantism and Protestants. That's what this is all about. The papacy's attack on libertinism, his attack on popular forms of government, his attacks on freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, his defense of monarchism, his defense of the sanctity of the Roman Catholic Church and the sanctity of his priests, being completely separate and irresponsible to the government and the civil power and the people, is all directed against Protestantism and Protestants. Because all of these things came as a result of the Protestant Reformation. What we're reading here is the Pope's mental wrangling, twisting of logic, twisting of Scripture to defeat Protestantism. It's the Counter-Reformation that we're looking at here. And of course, it's led by the Jesuits, as this Pope was educated from a very young age by the Jesuits. This Pope is an instrument of the warfare perpetrated upon Protestantism and upon Protestants levied by the Jesuits in fulfillment of their oath, which, by the way, I haven't read here on this program for a good long time, and it might be time to review that oath. But if you're familiar with the extreme oath of the Jesuits, and you are paying attention to what we're reading in this book, you can see that they are true to their oath. Now, many people question the authenticity of the oath as we have it, and as we've read it and discussed it here on Inquisition Update. But be that as it may, simply look at the operations of the Jesuits throughout the world, and you can see that they fulfill that oath. Let me state it another way. If you were unaware of any oath of the Jesuits, simply all you would have to do is look at the history of the Jesuits and how they have behaved since their founding in 1540 to the present. And if you had to write the tenets of Jesuitism in the expression of an oath, that's the oath that you would write. It would look very similar to what we profess to be the authentic, genuine oath of the Jesuits. It's a war against Protestantism. It's called the Counter-Reformation. Anytime you hear the word Jesuit, you should automatically hear Counter-Reformation. And no one was more astutely trained to wrestle with Protestantism than was Cardinal Pesci, Pope Leo XIII. He says Cardinal Pesci dealt more directly with the, quote, irreligion and libertinism, unquote, of the present age in a Lenten pastoral on the current errors against religion and Christian life. Here he expressed himself with severe intolerance against those who proclaimed that, quote, man is free in his own conscience. He can embrace any religion he likes, unquote. That is, he condemned the freedom of religious belief. He could not have done otherwise without causing his fidelity to the papacy to be suspected. Consequently, he made his meaning perfectly clear so that none of the faithful could mistake it, and doubtless because the freedom of conscience is necessary to popular government, which, in serving the Pope, he was obliged to condemn. Nevertheless, he was driven to the necessity of admitting that man is created, quote, free and gifted with reason, unquote, but sought to break the force of that admission by insisting that this natural freedom must be subject to restraint, because God has imposed obligations upon him and dictated laws for him which he is bound to obey. He, however, gives no latitude to the individual and makes no allowance for his private conscience, but considers him incompetent to decide for himself within the scope of religious laws, and as fit only for obedience to authority. That is, the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope who may, for the time being, preside over it. In setting forth the manner in which God has made known his laws for the direction and government of individual consciences, and how he requires them to be obeyed, he insists that they are only such as the Roman Catholic Church has announced, and that the natural right of the human reason to its freedom must be restrained into obedience to them, so that the only liberty of thought or conscience to be allowed must be that which centers in his obedience. To him, any other freedom than this violates the divine law and is heresy. But he plainly involves himself in the absurdity of supposing that to be freed, supposing that to be freedom, which is the very reverse of it. For there can be no proposition more palpably true than that a man has no freedom of thought or conscience when constrained by a force he is powerless to resist, to exchange his own opinions for those of others. It may well be doubted whether opinions formed under the dictation of authority are in fact such. Fear of consequences may induce acquiescence in them, or even their avowal. But as the laws which govern the mind and conscience have no agency in their production, they are simply utterances of the lips which are not responded to by the heart. This must be the case with enlightened minds, except where pre-existing opinions are changed by the force of argument and new enlightenment. The papacy understood this, and therefore kept in ignorance the populations within the circle of its influence and jurisdiction. Now you know why the people were illiterate. To keep them obedient. R.W. Thompson has just revealed the mechanism by which the papacy kept the people obedient, subservient, and loyal to the papacy because they were illiterate. They were unable to think for themselves, to reason for themselves. The Pope regulated the consciences of the people by simply denying them the ability to reason and to communicate. If that's where the papacy would have us today, if it had its way. He says, and Cardinal Pesci, instructed as his mind was upon general topics, was unable to conceive any other method of human thought than those instilled into his mind by his Jesuit education, and which his official position made it necessary for him to maintain. So we have a man properly fitted for this attempt to establish the belief in the world that the Roman Catholic Church is a divine institution, that the papacy is divinely created, and not just a creature, but the very replacement of Christ on earth, and not to be judged by any man or any government, and must be free of all bondage so that he may do as he pleases in governing the world. Jesuitical teaching, Jesuit teaching. Pope Leo XIII was a product of his Jesuit upbringing. And there's no room in true Roman Catholicism for freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of... There's no freedom. The papacy also teaches that as a matter of Roman Catholic canon law, no man has any liberties that were not given to him by the Pope. So if you enjoy a liberty in this country, it's because the Pope gave it to you. Or the Pope just hasn't cracked down yet. You're a product of his leniency. You're a product of his patience. But if given full sway, as the Pope will have during the New World Order, all your liberties are going to be taken away. If we don't claim liberty in Jesus Christ, the Pope is going to claim us as his subjects, to do with as he pleases. And in that state of affairs, you're going to be expected to be, as the Jesuits even claim in their oath, as a cadaver, with no thought or will of your own, like a stick in the hand of an old man. That's the ideal form of government, papal government, Antichrist government. Now he says, controlled entirely by the idea of unresisting and uninquiring obedience to authority, without any regard for dictates of individual conscience or the suggestion of reason. He announced the logical result of his own and papal teachings in these words, quote, "Nor is it left to free will of man to refuse it, or to fashion for himself a form of worship and service such as he pleases to render." Unquote. It does not require a man of learning to understand this. It is plain and palpable to any ordinary mind. He could have chosen no words more expressly condemnatory of the freedom of conscience, nor could he have more formally arraigned the people of the United States for having asserted the right of every man to worship God as his own conscience dictates, and having made that fundamental in their institutions and necessary to their existence. According to him, this is heresy, because it draws the people away from obedience to the Pope, and no man has the right to refuse this obedience, or, quote, to fashion for himself a form of worship or service, unquote, which the Pope shall condemn. And what form of worship and service does the Pope most vigorously and consistently condemn? True Bible Christianity, Protestantism. That's the target in Protestant America, the very foundation of our country. We'll be back right after this.
100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial. The mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a left behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
Record budget deficits, bankruptcies galore, and the U.S. dollar is at an all-time low. With today's gloomy economic outlook, safe investments are often hard to find. For over a decade, Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company has been helping people secure their future by investing in the precious metals. Melody has the honesty, integrity, and experience that is often lacking in the precious metals business. Let her put it to work for you. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to the second half hour of Inquisition Update, and we'll continue where we left off before the break. And this deserves some explanation. It says, Pope Leo XIII is immeasurably shocked at the idea that men should be permitted to entertain and to express different religious opinions, and to reject the teachings of the Pope, to whom alone implicit obedience is due. Now, some thinking man who's paying careful attention to this book might be ready to ask me the question, Well, Tom, if the Pope insists that we become Catholic, that the whole world be Roman Catholic and subject to the authority of the Pope, doesn't that contradict the ecumenical movement? The attempt to unite all religions? I mean, if it's Roman Catholic canon law, the focus of the papacy and the papal supremacy, the temporal power of the Pope is all important to the papacy, how did they come up with the ecumenical movement? That seems to be contradictory. Well, let me give you an example in history that will explain that. Remember when the Pope crowned Charlemagne? If you realize the significance in that event, you realize that when the Pope crowned Charlemagne, he defeated Charlemagne. Because logic holds that if the Pope can crown the king, the Pope can remove his crown as well. Literally, when Charlemagne knelt before the papal throne to receive his crown, he was surrendering to the papacy. And the Vatican, in an attempt to make the whole world Roman Catholic, simply did a replay. When in 1983, I believe it was, Pope John Paul II invited all the religious leaders of all the various pagan religions around the world to come to Assisi and worship with him in a common worship service. And the World United Religions Initiative proclaimed that all the religions of the world now recognize the papacy as the supreme religious leader of the world. You see where this is going? It's just like crowning Charlemagne all over again. By acknowledging the Pope as the supreme religious leader of the world, the Pope destroyed them without even firing a shot. With their own words, they brought themselves into subjection to the papacy. Now, of course, in the Roman Catholic Church, they teach that you must be Roman Catholic. You must obey Roman Catholic canon law. You must believe what the priest tells you. You must serve the Pope and not the governments under which you live. That you're first and foremost a Roman Catholic. But see, that's where this new world order is, that's how this new world order is going to relate to all the other religions. You must submit to Roman Catholic canon law. If I am the supreme spiritual teacher of the world, as you have acquiesced to, then you must conform to Roman Catholic canon law. You must accept the Pope's supreme teaching authority, the supreme pontiff, the spiritual authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And if you acknowledge the superior or the supreme spiritual authority of the Roman Catholic Church, which you already have done in this ecumenical movement, then you must also accept his temporal power. You see, they've just broadened the playing field. Now it's not just the quote-unquote Christian nations of the world. It's all the nations of the world and all religions. The Pope has crowned all the religious leaders of the world. They all knelt before his throne and received their crowns from the Pope. That means they acquiesce to his jurisdiction and his authority. So there's the example in history that is the model for the New World Order and the ecumenical movement. And now Rome is literally free to govern the world by uncontentious acquiescence, by flattery. See, John Paul II flattered all these religious leaders of the world when he invited them to his house to celebrate a common religious service, acknowledging all these religions as valid. And by that flattery, they returned flattery for flattery and acknowledged him as the supreme religious leader of the world by flattery. One of the most effective devices of Satan there is, flattery. That's why I get real defensive when people become flattering of Inquisition Update and of Tom Press. a lying tongue, a slick tongue, to be feared more than nuclear war, because that's what's going to result from this flattering tongue of the papacy and the flattering tongue of those who wish to be crowned by him. Now, the Pope is immeasurably shocked at the idea that men should be permitted to entertain and express different religious opinions and to reject the teachings of the Pope, to whom alone implicit obedience is due. You see, now these words apply to all these other religions, not just the so-called Christian nations of the world, but all other nations too. He says the Pope is immeasurably shocked at the idea that men should be permitted to entertain and express different religious opinions and to reject the teachings of the Pope, to whom alone implicit obedience is due. Why? Because they submitted to his authority by acknowledging him and by being crowned by him. He says he had too much character at stake to disguise anything upon this point, leaving that to others in free countries, where the pretense of toleration may be maintained with the hope that it may ultimately pave the way to papal intolerance. Continuing, therefore, the same undisguised denunciation of freedom of conscience, he says, quote, "It would be not only impious but monstrous to maintain every form of worship as acceptable and indifferent, that the human conscience is free to adopt whichever form it pleases, and to fashion out a religion to suit itself," unquote. You see the ecumenical spirit in this too? Embracing all the other religions to apply Roman Catholic canon law to them. See, it isn't just Protestantism that the Jesuits intend to exterminate and eradicate. It's all religions that oppose the temporal and spiritual power of the Pope. Now, these other cults that the Vatican invited to Rome should have stayed home. But because they accepted the invitation of that glamorous whore that rides the bloody beast of Revelation 17, they became his subjects, his spiritual subjects. And now they're going to be made his temporal subjects by the United States military armed forces, the battle axe for the Pope, going to impose the Pope's temporal sword all over the world because they've accepted the Pope's spiritual authority. Can't separate the two keys of the Pope. The golden key represents his spiritual authority. The silver key represents his temporal authority. They're bound by a scarlet-colored cord. You can't separate those without the shedding of blood. To try to separate the temporal power of the Pope from the spiritual power is a declaration of war to the papacy, and he may use any and all power at his disposal to unite those two keys again. And not just over the Protestants, but all the false religions according to the papacy. To make them all Catholic. To be Catholic is to be subject to the authority of the Pope. The papacy, from nearly its founding, has claimed the divine right to rule the whole world, not just the quote-unquote Christian world. So the papacy had to expand its area of operations, had to expand the playing field to include the whole globe. And that's what John Paul II did. And I assume, I can't believe it's taken him this long to canonize him. He conquered the world for the Pope, for the papacy, for the Antichrist, by simply doing to the other religious leaders of the world what he did to Charlemagne. He just simply placed his crown on them, on their heads. He says, it is not necessary to comment here upon this bold and defiant assault upon our civil institutions, but it is well to remark that it ought to tinge the cheeks of those in this country who, in one breath, profess obedience to the Pope who uttered the language here quoted, and in the next talk glibly about their advocacy of the freedom of conscience, which he has condemned, which the Pope has condemned as impious and monstrous, as an unpardonable offense against God. You see, he makes us defy our own reason. He's deceived the whole world. The whole world is in confusion. And who confused the world? Satan, through his human agency, the Pope. It's not a divinely inspired institution. It's a satanically inspired institution. He says he then proceeds to speak of the relation of the state to the education of the youth by saying that it is, quote, not called upon to discharge this great parental duty, but to keep the natural educators in their work, unquote, by permitting it to be, quote, carried on under the direction of the Roman Catholic Church, the depository and teacher of religious doctrines, unquote. You see, the Pope claims to be the sole teacher of the world, that only he has the ability to read and to interpret the Scriptures and then to teach truth to the world. The schools, the public school systems in all the nations, unless they taught what the papacy taught, were heretical schools. R.W. Thompson continues, he says, this is as if he had said that the state shall be forbidden to participate in the work of education, even to the extent of teaching patriotism to its youth, for the reason that such state education has the tendency to substitute love for the country for fidelity to the Pope. The public school system have replaced obedience and fidelity to the Pope to obedience and fidelity to the state. And where is that most offensive to the papacy? Why, of course, in nations like the United States where church and state have been separated. He says, and for the further reason that all education that can be tolerated should, quote, be carried on under the direction of the church, unquote, and confined exclusively to, quote, unquote, religious doctrines. He expresses the same idea more fully by insisting that all other kinds of education are, quote, devoid of all the external practices and duties of the Christian faith and calculated to familiarize young people with freedom of conscience and indifferentism. That is, to encourage them to the belief that popular freedom is worth striving after and that people are more prosperous and happy when governed by laws of their own making than by those dictated by the ambition of those who claim that they alone are divinely chosen to govern mankind. He sees nothing in such religious liberty as our institutions establish but irreligion and libertinism, to which it has given rise and against which he strives hard to enlist all the supporters of the papacy. Remember, he called for a global religio-political organization of Roman Catholics to reestablish the temporal power over Italy, and then, having achieved that, to restore the temporal power all over the world where it had been lost, and then extend it to where it had never been exercised before. Calling all Roman Catholics to come to the aid of the Pope. He's a beggar. He's not like Jesus Christ. He's a beggar. He has to solicit Roman Catholic help. He has to solicit the help of the American military, the American State Department, the American Defense Department, the American Supreme Court, the American Congress and House of Representatives. He's a beggar. Nobody just willfully bows down and worships the Pope unless he's completely deceived by Satan. So the Pope has to rely on coercion. He has to rely on coercion. That's why the Bible describes him as a beast. It says, from the papal standpoint, his arguments are sound and logical because the general enlightenment of the mind, which enables it to investigate and understand the causes of things and makes it competent to form conclusions of its own, tends to create self-reliance and opposition to oppressive laws, and has on these accounts been odious to the Pope. So ever since they acquired temporal power and made the Roman Catholic Church, by means of the temporal power, the most potent instrument in maintaining monarchism. Monarchism. You know, you hear this big argument, well, is the New World Order going to be communistic or socialistic or fascistic? all of those discussions are moot. All of those discussions are moot if you understand that the New World Order is going to be a monarchy. And then once that monarchy is established, the Pope can adopt whatever political persuasion he wishes to suit his fancy. And one portion of the world might be socialistic, another portion of the world might be communistic, and another portion of the world might be democratic, and another portion of the world might be fascistic. It doesn't matter to the Pope as long as he is the monarch of the world. You see, we've all been convinced that politics is the name of the game. It's all about politics. What form of government should the world, fancy? And that's to keep everybody busy in worthless discussions. So that the discussion that we're having here with R.W. Thompson on Inquisition Update is never had in the world. And it works quite nicely. I was thwarted in all my efforts to discuss these things on amateur radio simply because everybody wanted to return the discussion back to Democratic versus Republican politics. You see, they wanted to take the real, substantive, and important discussion away from the papacy and place it back on politics. They wanted to delude themselves with continuing in any discussion that seems to indicate that there's any difference between Democrats and Republicans, that the battle lines are drawn between Democratic and Republican forms of government, and never, ever, ever was it discussed or accepted that the Pope controls both of those political parties, just like he controls communism and fascism and socialism and all the other isms. All those forms of government were the brainchilds of the great, quote-unquote, fathers of the Roman Catholic Church. The Jesuit Cardinal Bellarmine was the one that came up with democracy. It's all a smokescreen. It's all a means of deluding the people of the world so that the Pope may continue his agenda under disguise. Of course, when you, like most Americans and most Christians, have spent all your life studying politics, taking the side either of the Republicans or of the Democrats, anybody who suggests that there's no difference between the two and that they've wasted all of their adulthood focusing on these politics, they simply dismiss you as a kook, even though everything you say makes perfect sense. You see, they've got too much invested in their political discussions. They've devoted their whole life to it. They can't abandon it and admit to themselves they've been deceived, so they keep trying to return the discussion back to politics. Well, it's not about politics. It's about the Pope. It's about the Pope. It's about the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church, Revelation 17 and 18, the Antichrist. And when you stay on that discussion very long, in order to defend their right to talk about about politics, Democratic or Republican, they call you a hater. They label you an anti-Roman Catholic bigot. They try to destroy the messenger, despite deep down in their hearts knowing there's something true about this. Tom Fress on amateur radio knows what he's talking about, but if it's true, then I really have been deceived. Papacy controls all the governments of the world and all political persuasions. They're all a puppet show that distract all of our attention so that nobody focuses on what lies behind the curtain. Nobody finds the puppet master behind the curtain who plays the strings on both sides. From the papal standpoint, his arguments are sound and logical because the general enlightenment of the mind, which enables it to investigate and understand the causes of things and makes it competent to form conclusions of its own, tends to create self-reliance and opposition to oppressive laws, and has on these accounts been odious to the popes ever since they acquired temporal power and made the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, by means of that temporal power, the most potent instrument in maintaining monarchism, by maintaining popery, by maintaining Antichrist. He says, therefore, the student of history finds that the papacy has grown weaker as the world has increased in enlightenment. See, that's why the Pope is a beggar today. That's why the Pope has to use deception, because the people are getting wise. Slowly but surely, the people are being enlightened. But from the standpoint of our free institutions, both his positions and reasonings are radically wrong and indefensible because they assail the freedom of conscience which our institutions guarantee to every individual, and our common school system, which is more responsive to the public sentiment and will than any other measure of public policy. The plain and manifest import of what he has said is this, that if he were allowed full liberty in this country to dictate what shall and what shall not be regarded as true religion, we would have neither freedom of conscience nor public schools. And this, by his subsequent elevation to the pontificate, constitutes today the greatest, if not the only, danger which threatens our free, popular form of government. Did you hear what R.W. Thompson just told you? The papacy is the greatest, if not the only, danger which threatens our free, popular form of government. And he's absolutely correct. Roman Catholicism, popery, the Antichrist, is the only threat to our free institutions, our Protestant institutions. And if we're losing our Constitution, if we're losing our institutions, if we're losing our liberty, and if our country particularly is uniting church and state, you have to proclaim R.W. Thompson one of the greatest secular prophets of the age. He's absolutely correct. And the facts lay clearly before us. The evidence speaks for the facts. Observable facts on the ground. R.W. Thompson named the only enemy that could overthrow our Protestant institutions in this country. It's a done deal. Sorry to end on such a pessimistic note, but it's the truth, and we'll continue to teach the truth here on Inquisition Update Monday on First Amendment Radio. Thanks for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.